So we're going to be starting off walking you through what Eastern Light is and just some real quick setting the table. Eastern Light is a contract manufacturer within the distilled spirits world that also offers storage and logistical support. Essentially, our role is that we manufacture a whiskey, but instead of setting on it for the next 8 years and then hoping to sell it to the general public, we sell it almost exclusively to other businesses the day that it's distilled, and then we switch into rental and storage mode, where we provide a place for that barrel to mature over the lifetime of its maturation. Now, the nature behind our conversation, I want to make it very fair and upfront. We're in the process of raising the last bit of our equity in order to build out all of our facilities, and currently we're looking for investors. Right now, of the 22 that we're targeting, we've already raised 12, and we're looking for the last 40-ish% of our raise in order to close things out. We're doing this by issuing units in the LLC that owns and operates everything. We are giving a 15% preferred return, access to normal distributions, and a whole host of tax advantages that come endued within our deal. But before I get into that, I want to toss it over to a gentleman named Nick Schrobenhauser, who truly is an industry outsider, so that he might give you a bit of an introduction to maybe the lens with which to view our deal.
It's great. Thanks, Caleb. I'm not sure if anyone can see me while I'm talking. That is unnecessary. If you can't, hopefully you can hear my voice at least. And there is a picture there, I guess. Before I hop into giving you the aspects of the opportunity that stood out to me as I was considering an investment in Eastern Light, an investment that I ultimately made in addition to joining as a strategic advisor to the business. Let me give you a little bit of my background to kind of frame my portion of the discussion. So I've spent the last 2 decades in investment management, both working at and eventually running public equity hedge funds and eventually private equity, growth equity funds. So I think the lens through which I considered this opportunity is probably fairly similar to the lens through which many of you might consider it. In every investment that I have ever made, I have always sought to seek out or keep an eye out for specific attributes about any given business that would stand out to me as positive contributors to the potential success of that business. A handful of which certainly apply to Eastern Light Distilling. I will walk you through a couple of those. When I'm done doing that, I will turn things back over to Caleb. He will walk you through kind of the remainder of the business in greater detail. We will talk about some of the kind of risks and the asymmetry of those risks relative to the return profile. And then certainly at the end of the discussion, we will open it up for Q&A if any of you would like to dive into any specific portion of the conversation in greater detail. One last thing, just touching on what Sennett said. I am also a non-drinker. I don't drink at all, which you may say is kind of crazy for someone who made an investment in a whiskey business. But to me, the fact that the product that is being produced is bourbon is almost secondary to the other attributes of the business. And I think as we get into kind of the meat of the discussion, you'll see the reasons why. So maybe with that, Caleb, do I control the movement to the next slide or do you? There we go.
Nope,
Okay, perfect.
I've got it.
Okay, so a handful of items really stood out to me. There is kind of one on here that isn't directly listed. We will kind of get to it later in the sort of risk protections portion of the discussion. But these are 4 items that really stood out to me in terms of positive attributes to the business. So first and foremost, early cash flow. Why does that exist? One of the very first questions that I asked to both Caleb and his co-founder Cordell was both a statement and a question effectively. I said, if you do not have customers or clients, you don't have a business, you just have an idea. So tell me a little bit more about that. At present, we as a business, Eastern Light, have pre-sold under LOI 41,000 barrels worth of bourbon. In order for the business to break even, we would need to sell roughly 20,000 barrels worth of business. The reason the business cash flows early relative to the other end of the kind of the whiskey economic equation is because we create that widget, as Senator alluded to, which in this case is bourbon. We sell it the day that it is produced, and then we charge the purchaser rent to store that widget with us for the kind of life of, in this case, the aging process of the bourbon until it ultimately goes into bottles and then is sold on shelves. We do not need to compete at the tail end of the economic equation on the shelves in the liquor store against 30, 50, 100 different brands. We create a product, a widget, we sell it the day that it is created, and then we charge rent for the next 4, 8, 15, however many years. So that was very important to me, and it certainly tied into the fact that Caleb and Cordell had already pre-sold roughly 40% of the total annual production capacity of the facility. So that was certainly a very big box that I checked in terms of attributes that also act as protections to the business. Equally, in my mind, of equal importance, this is a heavily asset-backed security. So there is a 230-acre parcel. Caleb's background actually is that parcel of land. It is located in the first elevation change in Appalachia, which is important for some of the inputs that go into the production process. It is roughly 45 minutes east of Lexington, Kentucky, and about 2 hours east of Louisville, Kentucky. The reason why that is important is because we are outside of the saturation zone of all the other distilleries that exist in Kentucky. And Caleb will walk you through some of the details of why that is particularly important. But specific to the asset-backed security, the way that I viewed this opportunity was effectively a real estate deal with an option at an operable business, to perhaps simplify. It is going to cost roughly $50 million out of a combination of both debt and equity financing to acquire and construct the facility in its entirety. As stabilized by the bank, it has already been post-stabilization appraised at roughly $55 million. So there's a $5 million delta that assumes, in a worst case scenario, if everything were to go sideways, the moment that the kind of light switches and the machines are turned on, there's already a $5 million baked in premium. What that meant to me effectively was that if everything goes sideways, there is a very strong chance that I will get all of my initial capital back, plus potentially a couple of extra bucks. And the reason why I say that is because banks, when they're going through appraisal process like this, they like to keep the LTVs as close to in their favor as possible. So in my mind, although the as stabilized appraisal sits at $55 million, what the market could and would, in my opinion, likely bear could be considerably more than that. Just another reason why I felt that this asset-backed component acted as a very strong protection relative to the upsides that I'll get to in a moment. The third item is the tax efficiency. If we were having this conversation 6 months ago, we would have been singing from the rooftops about our ability to depreciate the rick houses. Rick houses are effectively the warehouse facilities where all the barrels of bourbon are stored over a 7-year period. So roughly 14% depreciation on an annual basis over 7 years. because of the recent changes to legislation in the Big Beautiful Bill, 100% bonus depreciation was reintroduced. Why that is important is because in 2026, we are going to, as an entity, have roughly a $46 million depreciation event. Why that is important is because, for context, an investor who invests $1 million into Eastern Light today will receive a $1.4 million share of that taxable loss to use against offsetting other passive gains that they may have elsewhere in their portfolio. Ultimately, immediately, and in my opinion, substantially lowering your basis relative to your investment in Eastern Light. For the next 5 years after that, we will have roughly $18 to $20 million worth of depreciation that we can pass through to our investors because the business is structured as an LLC, taxes the partnership. So all of our investors will participate in those depreciation benefits equally, equal to their pro rata share. And then the last piece, and this certainly stood out to me, and I think as Caleb walks you through how we arrived at some of these numbers, my hope certainly is that your eyes light up as much as mine did. The upside in this scenario, in my opinion, carries a lot more of the look and feel of a tech deal without being a tech deal, and without having some of the downside risks that I have many times in my career experienced. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes the downside risk was fairly binary relative to the upside risk. And what I mean by that is that if everything went sideways, in many cases, particularly in the tech deals that I was investing in, the kind of intrinsic value or any of the asset value effectively went to zero and ended up being a thumb drive in a desk drawer in a foreclosed building somewhere. Here, as I previously mentioned, due to the asset-backed security components, that asymmetry exists in a way that I haven't often seen. Caleb will walk you through how we get to these numbers that I'm about to tell you. But ultimately, in our projections, by 2033, that same $1 million investor, we would expect to have returned roughly $17.8 million to out of a contribution, a combination of both distributions and an exit. What that equates to is roughly a 46% IRR between now and 2033, which equals a 17.8 multiple on invested capital. Those are kind of the four main points that stood out to me in terms of, as Senate alluded to, that kind of asymmetry of risk reward. I think with that, maybe Caleb, I'll turn things back over to you to walk through kind of the remainder of the presentation. And then, as I mentioned previously, when we get to the end of things, we're more than happy to open it up to Q&A.
Sure thing. Well, Nick, thanks for setting the table. I do want to give you all a little background on myself before we go into the actual business because it gives a really clear picture of how we've got to this point. So my background is I was born and raised in Eastern Kentucky, a big fan of the sciences, and when I was in school, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to go into process engineering, biology, or chemistry. It was the combined love for each of these disciplines that I fell in love with a process engineering that was specific to distilleries. I started going out and shadowing different cookers, distillers, plant engineers, and some of the people who were mentoring me introduced me to the family ownership that was getting ready to build a brand called Kentucky Peerless. Now, at this point, there was no brand, there was no recipes, there were no facilities. At 22, I convinced this wealthy family that I was the guy to lead the charge building out their production facility. So I started with them in 2014. At the age of 22, immediately was able to take over, build out, and commissioning of the plant. Everything from setting up equipment, recipes, automation, building out a team. For nearly a decade, I was able to work there. And I was everything on the production and ops side of the business. My counterpart was a gentleman named Cordell Lawrence. Cordell had a very strong pedigree coming from Brown-Forman. He led a division that was global strategy for Jack Daniels, small brand, a little bit of experience there. But he ultimately departed from them to come join Kentucky Peerless to build out distribution into 45 states, 5 international markets. He essentially was the industry know-how as far as getting a product to market. I was the actual production force that helped the project succeed. Together, we carried them to a number of industry acclaimed awards. The two that we have shown here on the left was when we were recognized as the Global Craft Producer of the Year by Whiskey Magazine, and in 2023, I was recognized as Master Distiller of the Year. Quick note, prior to either of those, in 2018, I was recognized as the youngest master distiller within the bourbon industry. So had a really quick rise to prominence, had a lot of success, and ultimately God and a lot of really good people took care of me. Now, as with most things, when a unknown entity comes into unreasonable success, a lot of outside entities attempt to replicate that, typically with headhunting. And while there were some very flattering offers, there was a separate opportunity that became rather illuminated that Cordell and I couldn't ignore. See, we had a large segment of the industry coming to us for fractional services to help them plug in the missing pieces in what they were doing. See, most people, when they think of a brand on the shelf, they assume that every label goes through every step of the process, from grains to mashing to cooking to distilling, bottling it themselves. And this only applies actually to about half of the industry. Roughly half of the bottles you see on the shelf rely on third-party manufacturers, third-party stores, third-party bottlers in order to create the commodity that they ultimately market and sell. This is not something that is just isolated to small mom and pop brands. Some of the largest conglomerates in the world, some of the most successful brands in the world, utilize third-party manufacturing and storage to actually create their product. Now, with this being said, it is a bit of an adversarial relationship, and that was something that Cordell and I immediately witnessed, we lived, we saw, and ultimately we sought to correct. Reason being, a lot of people who own manufacturing, who have distilleries that sell off some additional capacity to third-party brands, to third-party businesses through contract distilling, like what we're discussing, they have their own brands that they represent. On screen, we have 4 of the major historic contract producers with the bottles that actually are tied to their brands. And the reason I'm bringing this up is they are roughly tenfold more profitable selling whiskey under their own label than they are selling it under a contract to a third party for them to make the money on. And as such, they do not want to compete with others. They want to put all of their focus on their own brands. So, for instance, if you are a contract purchaser, a contract label, and you went to Bardstown Bourbon Company, Bardstown Bourbon Company wants to focus on making $4,000 on their barrel, not the quick $300 to you. So they want to prioritize putting you under NDA to where you can't say where your product is made, how it's made, who made it. You get no affiliation. And in the world of marketing, if you're talking about a product that has as much allure as bourbon, if you don't have the ability to speak to its origin, you are going to war with an arm tied behind your back. You are in a losing proposition, and many of the contract brands are treated as second-class citizens within the space because of this. If you're looking at Bardstown Bourbon Company, Green River, Wilderness Trail, and MGP, who's represented on the right of the screen, each of these historically have been amazing brand or amazing contract facilities, but each one is taking steps to focus more and more on their own labels. Bardstown Bourbon Company and Green River were both acquired by Pritzker Private Capital, forming the Lofted Spirits Group. Wilderness Trail was acquired by Campari. Immediately upon the sale to Campari, they kicked out their contract customers and redirected 100% of their capacity toward their own labels and toward Campari's brand. With MGP, they actually merged with a group called Luxco, brought in a number of very successful labels, and they continued to be on the hunt purchasing brands such as Penelope. So basically what I'm saying here is while these people do address the market, they do so in a very restrictive fashion, where they will not say where it's made, how it's made. They treat the clients as second-class citizens. It's overpriced, overpaid. It is a broken system. And it's through Eastern Light that Cordell and I really want to right this wrong and create a new opportunity for contract distillers to be treated as equals, to be treated as people to work with. Together, we departed Kentucky Peerless at the end of 2023. We founded Eastern Light Distilling. We began structuring incentives, identifying lanes, where we want to build, site, location, and the whole 9 yards. Overall, we wanted to build this business on 4 fundamental pillars. One is transparent partnership. What we want to do is lift the mystique, invite these brands to come in, treat us as equals, and actually work with them. We want to give them a place to affiliate, where they can bring tourism, where they can ultimately showcase their production, their philosophies, their production team to the broader world through us. Now, they don't have to do any CapEx to do this. They just have to work with us on a barrel-to-barrel basis through contract manufacturing. The next step is customized solutions. Rather than putting unenforceable or unattainable minimum order quantities for small brands to be able to customize and actually make the product their own, there is not a MOQ that we offer in regards to customized production. If you came to us with the intent of making one barrel that was specialized in every category, we make that available to you. The last of the kind of softer positions is the brick and mortar inclusion. We are less than 3 miles off of I-64, which is the major east-west artery in Kentucky. Anybody in the mid-Atlantic who is coming to bourbon country, we will be their first and last stop for a major distillery. Now, what we're doing is, as we interact with these independent brands and businesses, is we invite them to be represented within our gift shop. We invite them to develop independent tourism experiences. They can bring barrel selectors there. Essentially, for the price of doing barrels with us on a unit-to-unit basis, they have the ability to affiliate in our brick and mortar. Now, these first 3 positions are very romantic, but they're a little bit softer as far as how you can actually monetize their benefit. So I really want you to focus on that fourth point, which is the financial efficiency with which we can address their needs. When we're talking about this, we're focusing primarily on contract production and contract storage. As independent small brands, they cannot effectively produce spirits for themselves at a class and at a price point in which they would be competitive within the landscape. I should have probably mentioned that as to why people do contract production at all. For many, it is not practical for them to spend millions building a facility, to run it inefficiently, to make product that is more expensive than they can broadly purchase on the market. So with this in mind, that is why many come into the world of contract production. Now, as you're looking to the other contract producers who are looking to get compensation more comparable to what it would be sold under their label, they continually drive the price up, and they're constantly dealing with the danger of being kicked out. So Bardstown Bourbon Company, for instance, is as they grow and as they grow their brand, they're actively displacing smaller contracts to internalize that capacity for themselves. That is not something that we intend to do, but that is one of the many adversities affecting this second-class group within the industry. So for us to be able to give them a suite of services, for us to be able to create a more attractive option, but also doing so at a cheaper price point, makes it almost a no-brainer for us to absorb market share. So the way we address this pricing is we attack it from 3 different angles. One is process engineering, where we've designed a facility that is more heavily automated, employs a lot more heat recovery than standard facilities, built with all the modern techniques and strategies in place, but also can dynamically produce a wide range of whiskeys, allowing each independent client to showcase themselves in a slightly different light. Next is associated with economy of scale. Big plant beats little plant, 9 times out of 10. Essentially what that means is we can take our investment, we can take our labor, we can take our overhead and spread it thinner across more barrels, improving our profitability, and ultimately our role is to pass that savings along to our clients. The last is associated with where we're building with our logistically gifted location. And for this, I really want to zoom in on 2 specific elements. One is the barrels coming to us, the other is the waste stream flowing away from us. The barrel is the actual most cost-intensive element as you're assembling a barrel of whiskey. It's not the grains, it's not the labor, it's the actual oak container that you put the whiskey into. Most distilleries purchase their barrels from hours away. They're trucked in, and during that, they not only incur costs, they also experience damage to the containers that reduce yields and ultimately hurt the profitability of the business. Well, we are built 7/10 of a mile from Independent Staves, newest and only greenfield cooperage within our portfolio. Within a mile of our facility, 1 million barrels a year are produced, and we already have an agreement structured to purchase every barrel we need locally. So on one hand, yes, this reduces cost up front, but the more costly element is the leaks that is actually reduced by not bouncing a barrel down the interstate for 2 hours and not by letting it dry out in the back of a box truck. So these three elements allow us to undercut existing industry norms in terms of pricing to a pretty heavy degree. To illuminate this, a group called Bloom Company CPAs, who's an industry specialist CPA firm who actually helped us assemble all of our numbers, reviewed all of our assumptions, they said for the past calendar year they saw a single instance where barrels were sold under $800 per unit as new make. For reference, we're planning on opening our barrel sales out under $700, giving us roughly a $10 million a year head start that we are handing out directly to our consumers. So with that, I want to speak to the model. We have three primary revenue drivers that we have modeled. One is contract distillation, which is where to a customer's recipe, we manufacture a barrel of whiskey, we sell it the day it's produced with no maturation, and that transaction is complete. It produces an immediate revenue that allows us to get into business, pay all of our bills, and then produce a very nice margin on top of that. The next step is contract storage. Many of the contract purchasers need a place for the whiskey to mature over the course of the better part of the next decade. And as such, as we build contract storage, it makes it a very affordable option for them to deposit into our warehouses. It is set there and it pays monthly rent as it sits. The last segment that we have modeled is barrel brokerage. So the aspect of many small brands carrying a decade worth of inventory is daunting. So typically there are also barrel brokers and investing syndicates between the producer and the brand that will hold that inventory for an extended period of time. Now, this is an appreciating asset. They allow it to grow in value before they sell it to the brand, but that is part of the industry. What we're doing with this small segment is we're holding less than 10% of our inventory until it is mature spirit, and then just broker wholesaling it into the marketplace for other brands to sell. But again, this is the small portion, a sliver of our overall capacity. To kind of break this out, we have these three primary revenue drivers in pretty deep detail shown on the screen. We're going to be producing over 100,000 barrels per year. Roughly 100,000 of that is going to be going into contract sales immediately sold to third party. This is going to fetch price tags starting below 700. Over the course of time, we want to climb back to the historic norms where 800 is really the floor, and then adjust for inflation moving forward. With that in mind, the price tag associated with that is very cheap, most of the time producing that under $500. And as we grow, we'll continue to find efficiencies to further bring that down. But in general, per barrel, we're going to yield a little over $200 in margin at startup. And as we mature, our plan is to roughly double that. Now, the contract storage is probably going to be the most familiar channel of our business to what you all are equipped or what you all are used to. And that is associated with essentially a apartment complex for barrels. Every fourth month, we're going to be building a new rick house where barrels are deposited. We fill it up. They pay roughly $3 per barrel per month, or at least that's what we've agreed to in our channels. But we have modeled substantially lower than that, as giving us the flexibility to incentivize people to move storage to us and the ability to incentivize contract production sales. So what happens is you have the snowball effect. The first day that we're storing barrels, there's nothing in capacity. There's not a ton of rental payments relative to the amount of labor and overhead we have. But as we deposit roughly an additional 100,000 tenants a year, you build this snowball effect of getting up to roughly 500,000 barrels, each of which paying rent, dramatically increasing the profitability on a unit-to-unit basis. That last segment that I mentioned, you'll notice has very little activity in the early years of the business. That's because the inventory that we've set aside has to mature before we can broker it into the marketplace. That being said, if we have an opportunity to sell it as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, we'll definitely review that, but we've modeled what we've seen elsewhere within the industry. This is by far the highest margin play that we have, but we want to stick to the core fundamental elements of the business, and that's why it represents no more than 10% of our overall capacity. When you overlay these three different revenue streams, you build a very strong income projection profile where you start off with net income of roughly 12 with a plan to build it to more than 80. Now, in order to build all this, in order to achieve all this, to fulfill those obligations that Nick had referenced earlier in the call, we have to build out the remainder of our construction project. We have already acquired our 230-acre campus. All of our site work is done. Our site sewer is in. Our architecture is complete. We have assembled a A133 architectural contract with our contractor of choice in order to build out our facilities. That is a guaranteed maximum price contract, meaning that overruns are at the risk of the contractor. So essentially, we have everything very tightly assembled, ready to go. This facility will produce over 100,000 barrels per year. It is roughly 50,000 square foot, seated in the middle of this 230-acre campus. Some very nice intangibles. It's less than 3 miles off of the major interstate. We are 7/10 of a mile from that cooperage, and actually we're 2/10 of a mile from the local airport. So if anybody needs to fly in and check out their investment, I'll pick you up. So moving into what it's actually going to take to complete this construction project, we have roughly a $57 million spend ahead of us if we're building it all the way out. So we have phases 1A and 1B that we are both reflecting on this sheet. That is essentially the distillery with land and equipment, representing roughly a $50 million spend. That was what Nick referenced. The remaining $6+ million is associated with the rick house. That is an optional component. Reason being, we already have storage agreements in place, to whereas at startup, we could move inventory to an off-site warehouse and then simply move it back once our warehouse is constructed. So the sources, in order to close all this, we have a $25 million USDA-backed loan. Essentially, our role in developing rural America, benefiting farmers, benefiting the community, has led the USDA to adopt and accept a 80% guarantee on that $25 million line of credit extended by Magnolia Bank. The next debt source is actually through CPACE, which is not a debt source at all. For those of you who are not familiar, it's a Department of Energy program, a conduit for private investment into the infrastructure of our deal that results in no equity, no reclaim, but rather a share of taxes for the next 30 years. So giving just over $38 million in debt sources, we're targeting $22 million to allow us to go ahead and build out all that we want to have. But if I get to 20.5 on the equity side, the loan's closed, the business is viable, and we are moving forward. Now, the nature of the raise is we're currently working to close the gap as we get to that $22 million targeted. We are doing that by issuing units in LLC that owns and operates everything. This was the structure that our CPAs recommended to make sure that we maximize tax efficiency, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. But structured with that, we are giving a 15% preferred return in perpetuity, as well as, because you're a unit holder in an LLC, you get access to distributions on everything above that. Of that 22 that we have targeted, we have already received cash commitments of $12 million. And you'll notice on here, I do not put any verbals on here. Verbals do not count. I cannot take a verbal to a bank. So instead, what we do is we only reflect capital that has actually been funded. That gives us roughly $10 million to get up to where we want to be. But realistically, with another $8.5 million, our loans will close and the business will be viable. We do have roughly $8 million above that 12 or that 22 target of discretionary units. If we have the right purchasing party, if we have opportunity, we can issue those and overfund the project. On contrast, though, in the event that we do not issue all units, those will be held in treasury, effectively concentrating the membership share of all of our shareholders. So, for instance, if we issue $25 million worth of equity as opposed to 30, which is the upper ceiling of what we can do, essentially everybody would own about 10% more of the distillery than they would have made their decision based on. The minimum investment is $50,000. The maximum that we have on the table right now would be $15 million. Now, I can go through all the different financials, but more often than not, people want to know, well, what does this actually present for us? What does the cash flow to an investor look like? So this is a scenario that we've prepared that effectively shows what a per $1 million investment profile would look like as projected. So right off the bat, the first channel that we look at is the preferred return via distributions. From the day that somebody funds an investment, the clock starts where 15% of their initial investment accumulates, and it must be met before we trickle into any sort of pro rata split. During construction, during 2026, there are not enough revenues for us to actually justify distributions. That obligation builds into 27, which is the first time that we anticipate cash distributions to start from Eastern Light. That year, we anticipate taking roughly 2 full years worth of preference with a small amount rolling to the following year. When we get into 28, for the very first time, once that preferred return is made current, we trickle into pro rata distributions, which is your share of the overall company of everything above the pref. So as you can see, the pref never goes away. That 150,000 per million is there to the end of time. But you may notice that the normal distributions, while they start off non-existent and then meager, should grow to actually dwarf the preferred return. Essentially, the unsizably large pref was mine and my co-founder's bet on the actual performance of the business. Essentially, that 15% represents a pretty massive hurdle that we have to make for you all before you all get the majority of everything else. Now, these are in regard to the actual cash flows of the business. The next question we often get is associated with, okay, well, what does the exit strategy look like? What happens when we are ready to exit? And the only way we can make any sort of knowledgeable guess at that or estimate is to look at what has happened with other transactions. So earlier in the presentation, I introduced Bardstown Bourbon Company. I introduced Wilderness Trail. Both have recently experienced liquidity events where they have exited to other providers. Bardstown Bourbon Company exited to Pritzker Private Capital. Wilderness Trail was sold to Campari. Now, to carve through some, I'll say, marketing numbers, I'm utilizing the capacity as quoted by the original equipment manufacturer, who's Vendome Copper and Brass Works, for each party's system. Roughly, if you're looking at the scale, Bardstown Bourbon Company could produce just over 7 million proof gallons annually. Wilderness Trail could produce just over 4.3 million proof gallons annually, and we'll be roughly at 7.3 proof gallons as per the manufacturer's recommendations for our equipment. Now, you'll notice from earlier in the presentation, I said that our model is based on selling just over 100,000 barrels per year. That's because ultimately we want to make sure that we put a model together that we can perform to or outperform. So I'm a bit of a sandbagger in that regard. My expectation is to exceed the numbers that we have within our pro forma. Now, as you're looking at those exits, you had one at roughly 14x its EBITDA multiple. They did not disclose the final exit valuation on that deal. For Wilderness, it was roughly a 16x EBITDA multiple, which resulted in a $600 million transaction valuation. The market was white hot at that time. I, with a clear conscience, could never forecast something at 15x EBITDA. But working with the people that actually advised each of those transactions, they felt that using 7.5x was more than reasonable. So following our projections for 2033, at a 7.5x EBITDA multiple, you would have roughly $731 million of exit valuation. Now, we do reduce that by all the outstanding debts, including CPACE, which technically we would not have to, but I can get into that. Transaction fees, and it results in roughly $600 million that could be passed to investors. So per $1 million, the investment profile on that exit would be around $12 million. So when you layer the $12 million potential exit with roughly the $5.7 million in cash distributions over that time frame, it builds to a MOIC of roughly 17.8, which is an IRR just under 50%. As Nick alluded to, these numbers feel absolutely stupid, but when you actually compare them against other industry transactions and the conservatism of our model, we absolutely believe that they can be reached. Now, there is another component to this. So as we're planning these really strong distributions over time, as Nick alluded to, there's a very strong tax strategy to what we're doing. So when the Big Beautiful Bill came out, one of the key imperatives, one of the things that it wanted to achieve was to incentivize investment into manufacturing within the states. And one of the ways it did this is it brought back 100% bonus depreciation. So effectively, the distillery is just a large manufacturing plant, of which of that initial spend, we generate a depreciation event of roughly 45.6 million. And because even though we're spending roughly 57 to create this asset, banks don't take a share of depreciation, and all of that loss must be distributed to our shareholders via their K1. So per $1 million of investment, we're currently forecasting a share of that 45 million of roughly 1.4 million to come through to investors. But it's not limited to just the startup of the business. The beautiful thing about the way the distilled spirits industry is structured as it relates to this tax policy is how the IRS views these barrel warehouses. If I were doing white label manufacturing for furniture and I built a storage warehouse for this, it would get depreciated out over the course of 40 years. But because I'm manufacturing whiskey barrels and the IRS for roughly 50 plus years have set the precedent that barrel warehouses are treated as equipment, we qualify through a cost seg to depreciate the full value of an asset that will be good for the next 70 years the day that it's put into service. What this does is as we expand our storage capacity, again, building roughly a $5.5 million warehouse every fourth month, it creates a huge tax shelter where it can take what would be 40 years worth of efficiency and compress it to the day that it's put into service. So what we're showing is that there will be depreciation tax losses of roughly 19 million, 19 million, 20.3 million, 20.3 million, all the way through 33, generating ongoing losses to help shelter your investment. So for instance, if we're looking at 2027 where we're planning to distribute roughly $321,000 to a $1 million investor, we're also planning to distribute to them $108,000 worth of loss, which not only means that we're helping with the actual money that we're sending out, we also grant a huge opportunity for someone to offset other gains within their portfolio. Now, before we get too much deeper, I do want to take a moment. I want to kick it back to Nick because everything we talked about is strategies and plans and how we believe things will go. I also want to give us a little bit of time for like risk analysis. Nick, a big part of what he's done is he's reviewed thousands of deals throughout his career, is understanding what are the risks, what are the things that could undermine the success that you're forecasting. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Nick and walk through a few.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I will start with the second bullet point of what happens if things go sideways and Caleb and Cordell get hit by a bus in the first week of the business. We kind of previously touched on this, and this is the asset-backed component and attributes of the business. There's roughly a $5 million delta between acquisition and development of the plant, property, and equipment, and the bank's appraisal of it. So in the event of a forced liquidation, you can certainly make a very strong argument that investors would be made whole on their original principal investment as put into the opportunity. So the reason why that's important is because it kind of seems to me like and certainly over the first couple of years of the business, assuming things don't go wrong, but it kind of treads water, out of a combination of the tax depreciation benefits and the embedded asset backing as stabilized protections, you fairly quickly, in my mind, get to a point where you effectively have, out of a combination of lowering your basis by using those shares of the taxable losses and the distributions back to you, effectively a free option at that 2033 17.8 MOIC and roughly 50% IRR, which I've very rarely seen in my career. This is the PP&E appraisal that I previously alluded to, which excludes the rickhouse. If it includes the rickhouse, the same delta between as stabilized and as complete exists. You just add another roughly $6 million to the as complete and the as stabilized appraisal. We can probably go to the next slide now, Caleb.
Perfect.
Yep. So the other major question that we get very frequently is alcohol consumption declining? The short answer is yes, but that fails to recognize the context of the question and the context of the answer, which I think is where the differences are made. With respect to whiskey and bourbon in general, if you are looking at this chart does a great job of describing my point here. If you are looking at kind of 2022 to 2025 in a vacuum, that certainly looks like a massive decline in growth trends for the industry. But again, it fails to recognize the context of what happened previous to that, which was a massive and severe uptick in overall growth rates, mostly as a result of the increase of overall alcohol consumption during early COVID. Effectively, what has actually happened is that growth rates have just returned to historical norms, which have been quite healthy for quite some time. So I think it's important to recognize both sides of kind of that turning point, both the increase and then the decrease. The decrease in my mind is really more of a mean reversion back to normal. This slide, we don't have to go through everything, but the main thing that is important to me, and I think it's actually better illustrated on the following slide, because it gives context to the overall alcoholic beverage market. Beer and wine, absolutely and objectively, have been in decline for quite some time. They are net losing new customers on an annual basis. There are two subsectors, and only two subsectors, that are adding net new customers on an annual basis. Those two subsectors are premium craft whiskey bourbon and premium craft tequila. And it just so happens that the subsector that we serve as an entity is premium craft distilled American whiskey. So I think that's important to note because it takes into consideration the overall consumption of the alcohol industry and then specific to bourbon. And then the second one is really the asset-backed component tied in with the tax benefits that both Caleb and I have touched on.
So my understanding as it relates to what type of loss it is, we go the most conservative typically when we're speaking to people, which would be passive losses. I have had people tell us all sorts of different things that they like doing with their own personal taxes. And as such, there's a level of liability there that there's a line I can't cross. So our intent is to show a loss as a business via the K1 related to the operating expenses and depreciation of the business. What each individual tax strategy looks like is beyond our control. We've had some people say that they're only going to be able to write off to the investment limit. The very first call after making that our standard, someone said like, "Oh, I write off more than that all the time." So depending on how aggressive you and your CPA are, there's potentially some latitude you can exploit.
Do you think that relative to W-2 income versus passive gain investment income, that is the most kind of conservative standard that we have heard, is that the taxable loss should potentially be used only to offset passive gains effectively in your investment portfolio versus W-2 income?
Got it.
Other people, like individuals, have said they treat things differently, but the most kind of conservative consultative advice, and we're not tax specialists, that we've received was that.
Beautiful thing about it is anything that's not used is not lost. It just carries forward to future gains.
Yeah.
So if you were to look at it via vacuum moving forward and say our investment's in its own little bucket, it would be 2032 before there would be a taxable event, despite us distributing more than initial investment over that period of time. Our role within the business is we create a widget better than the next guy and cheaper than the next guy, sell it to a third party, and then do storage. The actual process of getting it out of the country, marketing it, selling it, hoping that someone overseas is willing to pay for the tariff, because tariffs rarely actually are the business paying for it. More often than not, it's the actual customer at the end of the line who's having to pay. All that is on third party. Essentially, what we're doing is we're not coming into an industry saying like, hey, we're dependent on growth, or we're filling this crazy new niche. We're fulfilling a niche that's been here since the foundation of the industry. People have been doing this forever. We're just building a plant and in a location that allows us to undercut existing pricing structures. And really, our model is built on us being mediocre at what we do. Uh, that being said, there's been nothing mediocre about our career to this point. The cheapest MSRP that I supported through Kentucky Peerless was roughly an $80 package. So what we're doing is we're assembling a facility that's going to allow us to build products that are comparable with the luxury tier of the space, but at prices to where they could be competitive as little as $20 or $30 on the shelf.
One little piece of kind of interesting anecdotal information with respect to the tariffs. In general, that doesn't touch our end of the economic spectrum or equation, or however you want to think about it. But India, as a consumer of Scotch whiskey, is one of the biggest global consumers by a fairly wide margin. And if the American bourbon industry was able to replace 5% of that consumption of Scotch whiskey with bourbon whiskey, there would not be enough capacity for production. It wouldn't even be close right now. So in terms of like future global expansion opportunities, that definitely does exist. But to Caleb's point, the burden of crossing that hurdle effectively does not sit on our shoulders. It sits on the end brand's shoulders, or the payment of that sits on the consumer's shoulders.
And we speak a lot about bourbon. We actively will be able to produce everything from American single malt to rye, bourbon, anything that starts with grain and ends with whiskey will be within our strike zone. So there is a new fund that has actually been raised specifically to lay down a massive inventory of American single malt, which is a newer category of American whiskey. They're looking to place roughly 100,000 barrels per year worth of production. So far, they've only found 30,000 of that, and they're desperately trying to find more. If we were to receive a sliver of that business that's remaining, that alone would put us over the profitability mark. So the $1 million is what I had shown. Let me get back to it here, to where their share of the company comes down. We have roughly $50.1 million in tax loss. A big portion of that is associated with tax income. We also get to show some of that as far as book income. Now, all that relates down to the bottom line where you have $1.431 million. That is what would show up on your loss via the K1. If I understand correctly, much like we are LLC reflection of the investors behind us, the funds typically also pass K1s to their investors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what would happen is this investment block would come to you all, and then you would bust it up, I assume in coordinates with how much each one holds units within your LLC. I don't know if I answered the question. What were you hoping
No, I think that explains. So $1 million comes in 1.4 million first year.
Yes.
So it's like a dollar 40 cents per dollar invested.
Yep.
Yes.
And then from moving on, there's a small percent, probably a 10% loss that's coming in the second year. But starting the year 3 is kind of net positive cash flow.
We start showing that there is loss.
Yeah, got it.
So with this loss, even though, again, for 27, there's over $300,000 distributed, the K1 is still going to reflect a loss by virtue of the depreciation. The following year, there'll be several $100,000 distributed relative to $6,000 of income that shows up that has to be taxed. So what it does is it takes a long runway of tax efficiency, and it really compresses it from now until we're ready to exit anyway. Like everything else, plant, property, equipment, physical assets, they get insured. That is covered. Professional liability, all the normal things are there. As far as things that are kind of out of the norm, is we do have a very nice key man policy in place for myself and Cordell. Each of us have $5 million life insurance policies for which the company is a beneficiary. So we are covered in that regard to where, God forbid, if we get hit by a bus, there is a plan in place to be able to hire replacements. Beyond that, though, because the nature of our business is to sell and immediately get the product out of our possession, it will be on the actual ownership of those barrels to insure them. Now, through Lloyd's of London, we can get policies written. It's roughly 50 cents per barrel per month for the value. That covers catastrophic loss, not standard industry losses as far as leaks or things like that. But if there's a windstorm, if there's a fire, if there's some event that is outside of normal kind of acts of God type of things, those events are insurable. So our risk exposure, say that there's a rick house that's fully built and fully falls down, at most we're wanting to put 10% of our production into that brokered to where we're actually holding that inventory, and those will be insured. Those barrels will be insured. Through Kentucky Peerless, even though we were not equity holders or managers of the LLC, we were the professionals that carried that family from funding to build out. We actually had them at the table for a couple different exit opportunities, but ultimately it was a part of their family heritage, their history, and they wanted to stay in for a very long time. Respect that. So we've done similar work as far as the professional side for another entity. It was not in a position of actual equity, which is frankly why we went ahead and jumped to do our own thing. As it relates to Eastern Light, we have a full private placement memorandum, all the projections. We've arranged all the financing. We have already raised just over $12 million of cash that we have utilized for purchasing land, doing site development, some of the early phase construction stuff. And it's really just 8.5 that gets us to the 20.5 threshold at which the CPACE and USDA financing is triggered. So even though our goal is to raise 10 more, if I get 8.5, we're viable, we're thriving, and moving forward. This has almost entirely been raised through high net worth individuals, family offices, and then we have a few special purpose vehicles where investors have been aggregated. Technically, the equipment in place with very like talking about a hose to transport the material. Technically, we could do rum, we could do mezcal, we could do tequila. However, we cannot compete in those fields and be cost effective enough to offset what they're able to do out of country. So with that in mind, we want to focus on things that we are equipped to handle, can produce very effectively and very efficiently from a pricing standpoint. And we also get to lean into the provenance of Kentucky. When people want sparkling wine, they want champagne. When they want brandy, they want cognac. When they want single malt, they want scotch. And so for this, playing up the role of Kentucky being the go-to place for American whiskey is where we can really maximize our value. So it'll either be private equity who wants to position it to a conglomerate, or it'll be a conglomerate directly. So the typical purchasing parties, like for instance with the Wilderness Trail deal, that was sold to Campari, which is the parent ownership of Wild Turkey. They are a global spirits conglomerate. They're bullish on the industry. They wanted additional capacity. So they weren't buying it so much as, I love the contract business behind this. They saw it as something that they could add value to. They buy a business that's making a couple $100 per barrel, and then they invest behind the brand. They plug it into their distribution channels, and then they can sell more of the actual labeled spirit or break away some of its capacity to do Wild Turkey honey or some of the other lower SKUs within their portfolio. Then they're making several $1,000s per barrel. So it is a 1,000-unit LLC. There is 600 units that have been allocated for investors, 400 of which remain with founders. But that is not a true 60-40 split in return to proceeds. For instance, of the first $45 million that we have plans to distribute, roughly 35 of that is going to investors, with only 7 flowing back to founders.
Okay.
Oh, that math didn't math. 38 versus 7. So it's supposed to be 1325 Rodney Hitch Boulevard. And the reason I say it with that sort of question mark in between
Uh-huh.
is that Google puts it in the wrong place. So let me
Okay.
show you where we're at here.
And what city is that?
So it is near Morehead, Kentucky. So looking at what Nick was referencing, this is the first climb and elevation in the Cumberland Plateau. We happen to be situated just east of Lexington on I-64, which is the major east-west artery within Kentucky.
Okay.
We are just outside of the Daniel Boone National Forest, which is actually where the lake that serves as a reservoir for our municipal water source is seated. So it's a very clean raw water source. The exit that we are on, the closest town is Sharkey, which is not really much of a town. It's just a place on a map.
Okay.
We are building just north of the interstate in this large clearing of ridgetop land, directly adjacent to the airport. And this is Independent Stave, which is the global leader in American whiskey barrel production. This is the only new build facility within their portfolio.
Okay.
So the ability for our most expensive cost input to take a short ride on a road that doesn't have numbers on it even gives us a really nice benefit.
Mm-hmm.
This is the actual distillery site. Right now, we've cleared and leveled this entire pad, preparing for the distillery to be built here. Roadways circle the facility. Site sewer carries water to the rear. But yes.
And are you on municipal services for water and for sewer?
Yes.
Okay.
We actually are having a 12-inch water main installed, 8-inch for sewer. One of the cool things about being in Eastern Kentucky is you have affordable and reliable power. So we're 20 spans away from the major artery for electrical transmission within that part of the state. The neighboring company did not have a minute of power disruption in the past calendar year. So power reliability actually is one of the strong suits that allows us to build out infrastructure without being wasteful. So normally if you were building this in a less utility rich part of the state, you'd have to build roughly a $2.5 million fire suppression system. You'd have to install roughly an additional $750,000 worth of fire suppression pumps with backup generators and everything else. Thanks to the power reliability and the abundance of water, we have to build neither one of them.
Okay.
Which means we also evade the maintenance and ongoing expense and interest and property insurance associated with them.
Okay. Nice.
The other big thing is natural gas. We are adjacent to just that region has several major transmission lines for natural gas, making it both affordable, and you have several different people you could purchase from if you want. The local retail partner for that is Delta Natural Gas, also under agreement with us to bring us everything we need. So I'll give a little bit of the evolution of how we got to here. The first several million that we raised, it was friends, it was family, it was close personal network. As we grew, the checks became progressively larger and relationships became progressively more distant. Right now, I'd say our average investor profile is in for around 300,000. Most often, this is entrepreneurs, wealthy families, people who have made money elsewhere. We still have some smaller checks that come in, typically from professionals. We've got the three lead guys or three guys that are tied at the top are each in at $1 million. So it's almost always $1 million and below and pretty widespread. That being said, as we look to go out to close the remainder of this, we have signed on with a broker-dealer group called Matterhorn Securities. Tom and Mike, phenomenal guys, love them. We actually just went through their hit list last night. They're targeting a lot of funds that are looking to put in $1 to $5 million checks as their typical size. Some are a little smaller than that, some are a little larger than that. Their focus is going to be really on family offices and funds looking to deploy capital. Right now, everybody's buying the same class of unit as it currently exists. There's not a whole lot of preference. They're all buying units in the same LLC, the same voting rights, the same membership rights. Essentially, if someone has double the amount of shares of someone else, their performance and their say is directly proportional to that. As it stands, there's a handful of family offices in. A lot of the conversations that are developing are in that family class world, family office world. So the conversations that we're having with potential investors, perspectives, while it has worked in the past to talk to a lot of $50,000 and $100,000 checks, the same amount of effort goes into a $800,000 check or $1 million check. So what we've done is, as we've grown our network and it become a little bit better networked, we found ins to a lot of family offices, a lot of high net worths. And the next bunch that is kind of coming to fruition is actually kind of those that are funds, fund managers, RIAs, people who are essentially hired guns to deploy capital. I know that Discus is a big organization that represents a lot of spirits. Their work is primarily on economic data as it relates to how industry's doing, where things are moving. Ron, thank you for the questions. Really appreciate you. But as it relates to specifically tracking exits, that is notoriously hard. And there is a lot of errant information out there, which, for instance, when I was going through and explaining the scale of the different distilleries, publicly available statements on one of them, based against what the manufacturer says their equipment can do, they'd have to run roughly 400 days a year. So that was where, when I was level setting everyone, I wanted to give only things that were based in science and actually accurate. The group that assembled and assisted with all of our financials, performing everything, is a group called Blue & Company CPAs. They're industry alcohol specialists. The division that we work with is based in Louisville, and at any given point, they have roughly 65 different bourbon entities under their management or under their consult. They handled and assisted with the 2 exits that I referenced, and potentially gave us a little insider knowledge that I can't necessarily point to, here's this report or here's this website that says that. That being said, the Campari one was very public. They have a lot of data out there on that one as it relates to the 600 million valuation, as it relates to the 16x EBITDA. Maybe just don't trust what they say as far as what it can make. So of the land, and matter of fact, picture is worth 1,000 words, so I might as well just show. So the land that we own starts at this northeast corner, comes across, it actually flows through the tree line, it borders the airport, and then it comes up and over. Now, of that 230 acres, there's roughly 80 to 85 that is easily developable. But it also serves a very important role. It's neighbor control. It's making sure that there's nobody who can infringe. It acts as a natural security buffer because, man, one of these barrels is close to 600 pounds. If they want to carry it all the way down the hollow and back up the other side, they may deserve it. So it also gives us an opportunity to insulate noise, odors, anything that might be poorly received within the community. It just gives us the opportunity to control our sight lines and distance ourselves from others. So this was a piece of property that, of course, holds a very strategic point, being so close to the cooperage. As you can see, we already have power transmission lines through the area. As you can see from the aerial, there's these clear transmission lines running northeast to southwest. That is a combination of everything from electric to natural gas. It is a huge energy transmission corridor of the state. The storage, it's best if you have access to 3-phase electricity because the motors are a little smaller, a little cheaper. But effectively, you can get by with very little for a warehouse. The advantage primarily on the warehouse is related to the fire suppression. So we would have had to have built roughly a 3/4 million gallon tank, a structure, additional pumping, additional utilities in order to serve as the fire suppression system in order to mitigate a potential fire episode. So on that main campus, we'll be able to build out the primary distillery facility, tourism, retail, parking, all the manufacturing elements, and probably about 10 rick houses, which will get us through roughly the first 3 years of the business. But then we'll either purchase adjoining land, which we haven't secured an option on, but it has been priced to us. They've got to come down a little bit before we'll sign anything on that. Or what we'll probably more likely do is go a little bit further off the interstate into a slightly more remote area to build a rickhouse farm to catch the overflow production. The reason that we'd probably lean more in this direction is that from an insurance perspective, they don't typically like all of your eggs being in one line to where one wind on an isolated event could hurt all of their insured properties. So it may be something that they force us to move further away with that other side. The good thing about rickhouses, though, there's not a ton of day-to-day activity. You fill them. It's almost more like self-storage. You put it there. You don't come back to it for years. And when you do, you pull it out. You put another one in its place.
Are we talking a metal building or what is it really?
So the structure that we have priced and we have moved forward with is a pallet rick supported warehouse. So if you go to Lowe's, if you go to any big box store, you have the metal frames that hold up all the pallets, all of the inventory within those houses. A modified version of that is actually constructed to roll barrels onto rails for storage, and it is 6 stories high, or 6 levels high, not stories. With this, once it is constructed from all these individual components, you actually directly attach the walls and the roof to that pallet racking itself, which is why it is classified as equipment. So apart from a little bit of electrical ran to it and a sprinkler system within, it's a pretty basic warehouse that doesn't have a whole lot of frills. So typically you're going to see whiskey go anywhere from 5 to 10 years. There are some exceptions where people will sell it younger. There are plenty of exemptions where people will sell it older. And that is one of the underlying trends that, candidly, I love about the industry as far as where it's growing and where it's moving. Right now, the bottom shelf young age products are under a lot of pressure. And premiumization is something that's affecting all industries. That's why the middle class is eroding and people are either eating cheap or they're eating very expensive. Same is true with spirits. Well, as you're looking at how the industry goes to premiumization, there's only so much you can do with the actual manufacturing process. A lot of it, as far as what the public can easily digest, is associated with age. So they say, okay, we're going to start standardizing on 7-year age as opposed to 5-year age. 5 years is what I have projected. If we move up to 7-year age, that means that we can add roughly 40% more storage in order to accommodate these barrels aging longer. But it's not just limited to that. It affects the manufacturing side as well. Reason being, with every year that a barrel matures, it loses roughly 4% of its capacity or its yield. So what ends up happening is as they grow from 5 years in age to 7 years in age and charging similar prices, reinforcing their value proposition, they're going to have roughly 9% more whiskey in order to meet that demand. So that means that on the front end, we're going to have a huge uptick that does not result from growth of the industry, but rather the premiumization requiring more raw material to meet their actual customers' demands. So let's walk through a quick math example. So up front, we're looking to start selling whiskey. The very first promotion is roughly $650 a barrel. But let's say hypothetically we go through with that. We've got a promotion right now where if someone wants to store whiskey with us, a prepayment of $150 buys lifetime storage. So their cost basis is up to $800. Okay. Keep in mind, this is producing a whiskey that would be comparable to what I'd produced at Kentucky Peerless. So this $800 barrel of liquid broken down into 200 bottles, it's not a whole lot per bottle. You're talking about $4. If you spend $3 on packaging, you're at $7. Okay, you add another $5 for distribution, you're at $12. The remainder pretty much is margin. So you can get to the shelf under $20 and still be profitable if you get it in check up front and early on. So to paint a little picture of this typical supply chain that many independent brands face, historically they were buying new make $800 to $1,000 a barrel. Most of them could not buy it here because they didn't have the time or the luxury of setting on enough inventory to set for 5 years. So what ends up happening is a barrel broker, an intermediary, an investor buys it and holds it, and they'll flip it. Historically, it would be $3,000 to $4,000 to that brand. Well, the brand doesn't care because now they're being able to immediately buy a commodity, bottle it, and sell it. But they're leaving roughly two to three thousand or $2,000 there in between that the broker, whoever's holding the asset, makes. That's why that last segment of our model is so profitable, is because it's taking and combining a vertical of what is traditionally two different entities. But for someone who's looking to maximize their efficiency, say I'm talking to Costco and they want to do Kirkland bourbon. If we say, hey, why don't you get the same product for a third the cost? You just have to have a little bandwidth to park it on the side. They have the wherewithal to pull that off. So you're seeing a huge private labeling movement among Sam's, among Costco, among any of these large conglomerates. Total Wine, about when you go into a Total Wine and there is a manager special on a brand that you've never heard of, that hasn't been out in the world for very long, chances are it's a brand that they own. And so in that instance, they're making the spread of what the initial manufacturer broker would be doing, plus what the retailer and distributor is doing. It's a beautiful industry. We are the most insulated from tariffs and consumption trends and everything else because there are so many different places that we can take our product. If we make a barrel economically that's cheaper than other guys, which it will be, we could sell it as new make. We could hold it. We could finance it at a profit, cash flow wise. We can sell it to other brands. We can sell it to joint venture brands. We can create our brand. Right now, within our model, we do not have an ounce of brand support, suggestion, any of the actual retail services that we're providing and assisting clients with right now, including the biggest one of all, which would be at the end, which would be bottling. So if we have roughly 20 to 25 million bottles worth of product flowing out of a facility at maturity, not at onset, but at maturity, it all has to find its way into glass. A low margin for a co-packing facility is roughly $1 per bottle, meaning that if we get up and 6 years from now we build a co-packing facility, there's reason to believe that we could add roughly another 20 to 25 million dollars to our bottom line just by building out facilities. And this is something that's a if and a maybe and down the road, which is why we didn't model it. Our investors will have access to it. They will get to profit from it. But I don't want you making your decision based on that. What we did is we put together a pro forma based on maximum dilution, based on just those three revenue streams. Anything that we don't issue improves you. Anything that we achieve beyond those three revenue streams improves you. So what we can do is if we wanted to start an Eastern Light label, or if we wanted to take minority positions in some of our clients, we would improve the profitability profile of the mature whiskey. That is something that would improve the performance of the business overall, but because that is a riskier bet, I was not comfortable modeling it. Essentially, we only wanted to model things that were relatively easily attained and modeled. Anything that is outside of that, we have painted as blue sky that would improve the performance rather than take away from it. If we were to never build out our bottle shop, for instance, or our retail tourism or all that, right now it's shown as CapEx at a loss because I don't want you to make your decision based on 20 people a day showing up at a gift shop. It's just not going to be something that we have in our model. I think we'll exceed it. We have ideas on how we can make sure we drive a lot of tourism our way, but right now that is not a meaningful contributor to the model. So if I actually wiped that plan, your numbers would get better. So there will be some of our clients that want to sell whiskey at 2 years of age, and that actually slows down some of the capital burn because I can put a new barrel back in that empty slot. But on the flip side, I'm going to have ones who want to age it for 8 years or 10 years. So we went with kind of what were industry norms with the understanding that some people are going to sell young, some people are going to sell old. So Appalachia is the mountain range of the eastern U.S.
That part I follow.
It starts all the way down in the south and climbs up into New York, though it is almost always associated with eastern Kentucky, Carolinas, kind of that in the middle. As you come from the west to our property, there is a pretty sharp climb in elevation, And we set on the first set of ridges as you climb into the Cumberland Plateau, which is part of Appalachia. What this does is it produces ample airflow, amazing environment for barrels to mature in. So if you're looking at central Kentucky, typically barrel warehouses, some are in valleys, some are on hills, some are on plains. They're everywhere. Almost always the high elevation, high airflow warehouses are the most sought after as they produce some of the best whiskey. This is primarily because it takes the freshest air over the barrel, allowing for fresh oxygen, fresh air to mature into it. That is going to oxidize some of the things that are not very palatable as a young whiskey, helping them mature into esters and really fruity floral compounds. When you have barrel warehouses in low-lying regions that don't get that airflow, the inability to get humidity away from the barrel leads to mold, mildew, all sorts of nasty stuff that surrounds the whiskey that ultimately influences the flavor not in a positive direction. So us being up in that elevation, us receiving near constant airflow is going to make for some very nice whiskey. So we are adjacent to the Danube National Forest. It is a federally managed national forest, and it surrounds an Army Corps of Engineers lake called Cave Run. Cave Run serves as the raw water source that feeds a brand new water treatment plant that was put into service this February that has roughly 1.5 million gallons per day of excess capacity, of which we need just a small sliver of that. So we do have access to not just an amazing water treatment facility with plenty of capacity, but Cave Run is the cleanest raw water source in the state of Kentucky and one of the cleanest within the country because it's not industrialized around it. There are not factories around it. It is truly just seated in a national forest. So if I were to say the best comp set for what we're hoping to do is Bardstown Bourbon Company. Granted, they are at a maturity level where they're starting to push away and pull away from some contracts. As far as newer ventures that are really close, look at Kentucky Whiskey House. They started a little over a year ago. Within 6 months, they were running at full capacity. Similar leadership, similar background. They're really good guys. Of course, we have the things that we think make ours a little better. They have things that they think make theirs a little bit better. The advantage that I would say that we have specific to them is they're competing in a very over-encumbered labor pool because Ford actually just started one of the largest battery plants called Blue Oval directly adjacent to the community that they're in. So really high price of land, really high price of labor, and they're still within that saturation zone where it's difficult to get rid of the waste stream. For us being closer to the cooperage, closer to the farmers, and being in a part of the state that has typically been exploited for cheap labor rather than upheld for it, we think that we'll be able to drive a lower cost of goods. Plus our system's bigger. Next size up. So guys, I don't know if y'all intended for me to take your whole hour, but I'm really glad that we had the time together, and I really appreciate you all being so generous with your time and questions.